Aloha, everyone. Welcome to the Honolulu Museum of Art, Doris Duke Theater. We're so excited to be able to have everyone here. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. We're kicking off Classified. It's our multidisciplinary program featuring incredible world-class speakers and it's a program of public talks, film screenings, and workshops looking at the intersection between art and surveillance. So if you haven't checked out our Classified program, please check it out. Today's In Focus talk brings together some of the greatest minds and artists addressing surveillance in their work. Before we begin, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors. Thank you to Modern Honolulu being our hospitality sponsor. Thank you to our supporting sponsor, ACLU Hawaii. And we have two community partners, Inter-Island Terminal, thank you. And the Department of Art and Art History at UH Manoa, thank you. So as an arts institution, we're incredibly excited to explore this landscape of surveillance from an arts perspective. And we recognize that the collective brain power in this room, both on stage and in the audience, is quite immense. So we encourage everybody to take full advantage of today's convergence. Please talk amongst each other. Please use this space to connect for creative brainstorming and for forward-thinking collaboration. We are kickstarting today with a talk with these incredible speakers who I will introduce in just a second. And following the talk, which will be about an hour and a half, we'll have a special My Profile museum tour experience. So I hope most of you have opted in our lobby, and I'll be back on this stage sort of describing sort of how to pick up your tour after the talk. But more specifically, the talk on stage will last about an hour, and then we'll have a 30-minute Q&A with the audience, with you all. I hope all of you have index cards. We're passing it out earlier, so please, at any time during the first hour, write down your questions on the index cards. We'll collect them throughout the talk. So if you have a question and you're ready to turn it in, please raise your card in the hand and raise your card in the air. And we have volunteers on either aisles ready to pick them up. So at around 2:30, we'll wrap up the talk, and then we'll transition into the tour, and then we'll have a reception outside in Luce Pavilion, which I hope you'll stay for. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our artists, scholars, lawyers. So we have Ben Wizner, who's the director of the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Laura Poitras is a filmmaker, journalist, and artist. We're screening her films this evening. Trevor Paglen is an artist whose work spans image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and numerous other disciplines. Kate Crawford is a leading researcher, academic, and author who has spent the last decade studying the social implications of data systems, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And Hasan Elahi, who is our moderator today, is an artist whose work examines issues of surveillance, citizenship, migration, transport, and the challenges of borders and frontiers. And last but certainly not least, Edward Snowden is a former intelligence officer who served the CIA, NSA, and DIA for nearly a decade as a subject matter expert on technology and cybersecurity. Please join me in welcoming Edward Snowden. So without further ado, Mr. Elahi, please take it away. Oh, and I have your...
Thank you. Thank you for joining. This is amazing to get all these people here together, and thanks for spending the afternoon with us over here. So, Taylor, thank you so much for organizing this. This is really this amazing group of people in this gathering. I mean, we're just talking about this. I don't think we've actually had everyone here together. I mean, there's been a lot of overlaps. So this is kind of the the mega gathering of all these troublemakers, proud troublemakers. So also I want to thank the museum to do this, and especially the staff here, and also the members for making this happen, and the sponsor for this. So thank you. This is why we do this. This is great. So thank you for your support for making things like this happen. So I know we have a really packed house, and we have a lot. We were just talking about this earlier about how much we can probably spend hours between us over here. But I would like to get this started off right away. So, Edward, I'm going to start off with you and ask you a couple of questions, and well, really more of a general question about, this was your last home in the U.S. before you left, and so there's a connection that you have here, and you've done some things over video in the past. But I think if I remember that your last in-person event or presentation here in Honolulu was I think it was a fish box. We were talking about this privacy. I guess maybe the way to think about it is like there was I would describe it as sort of a workshop and our little instruction things. And do you want to talk a little bit about what you were doing here then and what you're doing now, and how the two of those come together? I mean, not like anything's happened in between, of course.
Sure. So primarily, I was getting into trouble. This was a period where I was working at NSA as a contractor, up at the tunnel in Kania. So on the way up to Wahiwa, if you take a left into that gated area, that's where it is. And during the day, I was helping basically build, expand, or directly I was using systems of mass surveillance. And it wasn't originally that I realized what I was getting into. First, I started off in human intelligence, but by the time I got to Hawaii and sort of climbed to higher and higher levels of sort of awareness and clearance, and had more and more visibility into the network, I realized that our interactions with the internet and our vulnerability to the kind of things that we were exposing to the internet had fundamentally changed. And we didn't actually know, as a public body, as a citizenry, that this was going on. There were senior officials from the top intelligence official in the United States, then General James Clapper, lying under oath to Congress about if the NSA was collecting any kind of information at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans, which in fact he was. There was a kind of deception that was going on. But I hadn't crossed the bridge yet into feeling that not only did I have sort of a moral requirement to move forward, but there was really something of a duty. As a worker in the government, you are required to take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. There is no oath of secrecy, right? There's a non-disclosure agreement, a civil agreement. But the idea here is what happens when you have this tension between an oath of service to the public, not a president, not an agency, and a non-disclosure agreement that says don't tell anybody anything about this. So I was experimenting in this hacker space in Honolulu. Whereas explaining to people at the same time I was working at the NSA how they could be safer online. And this was actually probably one of the first big risks that I took because, had one of the counterintelligence folks been in the room, I could have gotten in trouble for that. But fortunately, I knew who they all were. So hopefully I would have recognized them in the audience. But yeah, the funny thing about, this island is that there's such a huge military presence, right? And it's not that they're bad guys. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're fellow citizens, right? But there are people on the island that are doing bad things for what they believe are good reasons. That doesn't mean they're bad people, but we need to be aware of the kind of environment that we live in, the kind of future that we are building by going forward without actually questioning, is this right?
Edward, Ed, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing right now, particularly in, I think most recently there was a thing about Haven that's coming out and about protecting your digital life.
Sure. So now I'm the president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is an organization that basically tries to push back against the kind of abuses of authority that we've seen, not just in government, but in corporations, other areas around the world, to try to stop the press from working in the way that they were intended to. Whether we're talking about financial censorship, places like Visa or MasterCard trying to cut off press outlets whose reporting they don't like, whether we're talking about agencies or the president himself leading kind of a war on whistleblowers, as it's called, whether we're talking about journalistic sources or the journalistic outlets themselves. Or increasingly, we're starting to look fundamentally at technology, because there's this, everybody feels it right now. We're living in this moment where the things that we have taken for granted for decades are starting to be called into question. Right? We have always, as Americans, at least most of us, the more radical of us may have had more open eyes, but we presumed that our institutions could police the excesses of power, right? We believed fundamentally that the government perhaps might make false statements mistakenly, but we hoped they wouldn't be doing that intentionally. Currently, that no longer seems to be a reliable claim. So how do we deal with this? And one of the things that the Freedom of the Press Foundation that I'm personally involved with is, can we create a more trustless society? And that may sound like a scary word, like a bad word, like a regression, but what it actually means is, when we are extending trust without being able to verify whether or not that trust is being respected, we are entering a position of vulnerability. What if we could restructure systems, right, to protect us, to guarantee that our rights are respected, regardless of whether or not this agency wants to violate them, this country wants to violate them, right? Then we don't have to worry about the Russians, the Chinese, the NSA, or anybody else, because we're all safe. And this is kind of what Haven, this smartphone application that we just created, I don't want to take time to discuss it right now, but the idea is an expression of this principle. Can we create protection for everyone everywhere? Because if we're not all safe, fundamentally none of us are safe.
Yeah, I think, thank you. Thank you for that. You bring up a really interesting thing, and I think this, and feel free for any of you to jump in on this, but really about this thing of trust. I mean, who do you actually trust? And this thing of, and in many cases, there's been a lot of, there's been several examples of, even within these systems of trust, that the system doesn't even trust itself, and thus you have all these levels and so on. But really, in looking at this idea of trust and security or privacy, I think maybe this is a bit of an open-ended question, but who do you actually trust?
Well, I think the mantra of the national security state and the executive branch in the government is, trust us. Give us these authorities. We're going to protect you. And I think the constitutional principle that violates is that, I mean, if you read the Constitution and Bill of Rights, it was about kind of architecting mistrust of government. And Thomas Jefferson even talked about patriotic mistrust of government, that the duty of citizens is not to believe what people in power say, not because they're evil people, as Ed said, but because they're human beings, and because their natural tendencies in these bureaucracies will be to aggregate power and to cover up misdeeds. And so, yeah, it's interesting to sort of draw this line between technological systems that apply that principle, and really the more active citizenship that I think we're seeing on a mass scale since the election of Trump. where all of a sudden people are expressing that mistrust by subscribing to newspapers, joining organizations. The membership of the ACLU has gone from about 400,000 to about 1.7 million since the election of trust. And this is really people, sort of saying, these rights aren't things that we just inherit. There are things that we need to fight for, and we need to do that more actively rather than passively.
I want to bring this to more about something, of who do we trust our information to? Because as more of our information becomes, well, data. I mean, we're really actually in a situation where almost everything in our lives have been, in one form or another, some aspect of digitization. We're analog bodies, but yet there's this shift taking place between analog and the digital, where it's really our data bodies that are floating around out there. I mean, every time you see like the Experian hack or the Target security breach, where all your credit cards and all your data or your purchase records are now all public. So this thing of like the who actually controls that, and really, it's easy to say, oh no, the NSA, that's bad. It's like we don't want them collecting all our information, and so. But then we're so willing to give it to Google just openly, and Facebook probably knows us a little better than we would like it to know. So I want to talk a little bit about the control of it and trust of these systems, these structures of these systems of infrastructure of data, and where does that come into, where should we have a healthy mistrust of each of these? So please, this could be for any of you, but Kate, I think.
I'm being pointed at, so I think that's me. Well, I think that's exactly right. And as Ben has said, we've seen this moment of rising mistrust around the US government, but at the same time, we willingly trust, and I think in many ways are dependent on, a series of data platforms, including Google, Apple, Facebook, you name it. What's interesting now is that those companies used to be, particularly if you look at, say, Google, advertising companies, where it was really about getting your information and then targeting ever more precise ads to you. But that is no longer the case, and I think we're at a different inflection point right now, where we're starting to see these companies see the real value in your data in building very intricate models using what's called machine learning, or writ large artificial intelligence, which can be used to really find out and predict things about your life. And those predictions can have very significant real-world consequences. It could be tied into how much you pay for your health insurance. It could be used to decide who gets to go to university. There are some very intricate connections that we're now starting to see also in predictive policing. So I think what we've got to is a point where systems that we thought were about sharing information with our friends, that we're using to set up parties and gatherings, are actually being used to reflect on us, and are creating a very intimate type of prediction that will have long-term impacts. And I think for us, this is the next big trust moment, where we really have to start thinking about how these systems are going to be impacting our futures.
I would add to that, and this is something that actually, Ed, you were tweeting about the other day vis-a-vis some of the protests in Iran, is that when we're looking at these consolidations of information, what they are consolidations of power, right? And so I think that's the other part of that to keep in mind, is how is political agency being redistributed in a given society, being concentrated in very particular ways in institutions that have very particular interests, whether that is surveilling the entire world for military or intelligence purposes, or surveilling the entire world for the purposes of being able to modulate your credit rating and maximize the amount of money that I can extract from somebody, for example.
This is and I want
An important point, actually, if I could follow up on that real quick, because one of the things, the fundamental misunderstandings that we have domestically in the United States, that other countries don't necessarily suffer from in the same way, for example, Germany, given their past, is we have been told that surveillance is a topic of safety, right? That surveillance is about safety, that surveillance is about protection. And this is fundamentally a misconception. It's wrong. Surveillance can be used in that way, sure. But fundamentally, surveillance is not about safety and never was. Surveillance is about power. Surveillance is an expression of control. Surveillance is a way to shape the behavior of those that are being observed in different ways. And of course, we see this being used in different ways by, for example, the ad agencies that we talked about before. We also see this happening in places like China. A reporter was just riding the train to Beijing a few days ago, and she said on the trains there now, they are playing announcements, both in Chinese and English, that say if you break the rules on the train, it will impact your personal credit rating because they'll report you to the agencies. We also see the sort of growing complexity that Kate was bringing up and what these capabilities can actually provide. And China is, you can think of it as a canary in the coal mine. This is not stuff that's science fiction when we're talking about, just because we don't see it being abused in the United States yet. These are things that are already being done and coming here very soon. Just to contextualize this for those who aren't so familiar with it, I want to play just a very short video. It's about 30 seconds. From the BBC about what the Chinese police agencies, right? These aren't national level authorities. This isn't the Chinese NSA. This is just the local beat cops. What they are doing with their facial recognition technologies.
I'm trying to do a little bit of an experiment.
Sorry.
我们可以追溯到说，出现每一张脸都可以对应说他的身份证，以及他所经过，比方说在过去1周，我们回溯他的行经路程，我们也做了像人和车的匹配。那同时在人上匹配还包括亲属关系匹配，然后是你经常接触人员之间匹配。就是当摄像机布到或者我们传感器布到一定密度的时候，其实我们会经常知道你跟谁经常在一起。
I'll leave that there.
Pretty scary stuff. Well, you know, this is interesting because when you look at these videos, there's a very specific aesthetics and the way surveillance looks. And you know, there's this thing about like, if it looks like surveillance, then we recognize it as surveillance. But if it doesn't actually look like it, if it's invisible or when we change it. So and this is really, Trevor, Laura, please feel free to jump in and you as well. But what about the aesthetics of this? What does it look like? And how do we, you know, and what point does that become art? I mean, you know, when you look at like the history of like landscape photography or the history of landscape painting, I mean, that's all the link between that and expansion of warfare and surveillance.
Well, I'm thinking actually about your work. When did you start doing your surveillance work? That you surveilled yourself? What year was it?
That started well right after 9/11.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Post 9/11.
So explain that project and when you started it.
Oh, so basically, what Laura's talking about is shortly after 9/11, I got erroneously reported as a terrorist, and I spent 6 months of my life with the FBI trying to explain to them that I'm not a terrorist. So I would just photograph everything, and I would just send it to my FBI agent, trying to keep telling them that I'm okay. And this is still ongoing. I'm still doing it, not because I still have to, but I just, you know, it's opting in. So and then you know, and when you look at the imagery, and it's interesting looking at the shift in the technology. When I can look at the images from 15 years ago, and they look very different than the images today. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of an answer to your question, both what does it look like and what compels us to make art. And it's not a surprise that we're a white group and that you were the one that was targeted. And so when we talk about power and how
You got targeted.
I got targeted.
Yeah, you're in the club.
But it took them 6 years later to find me. So no, but in terms of, I don't think, I mean what Ed is saying, like in terms of how the sort of trustless society, I think that there are a lot of people in any society that already perceive the state as not to be trusted, right? African Americans, people who engage in political dissent, et cetera. And so I'm actually just curious about in the room, how many people, and really, and this is an honest question, not because you want us to agree with the panel, because I think you see us that we're a bit skeptical about surveillance, but how many people are worried about their information, about surveillance either from first the government surveilling you, how many people are concerned about that? Okay, and then how many people are concerned about corporate surveillance? Right, yeah, okay, that's good. I mean, I think this sort of, but in terms of the question about and how do you translate that into art, I mean, I think the role of art is to communicate and to express. I mean, and we do that in our own unique ways with our own voices. And so what I try to do with my work is actually understand how sort of power gets enacted and how it's embodied and experienced. And so to try to sort of document or understand from the perspective of people who are on the sort of front lines in a certain way. So with Ed, I mean, I'd been working on this sort of question of surveillance for a long time, and then everyone was like, "That's a really bad idea for a film," but then to be able to document a person who was willing to put their freedom on the line because they were so concerned about the dangers of surveillance is like one artistic expression. But there are, and Trevor uses his sort of own talent and skills for.
Can I make a point about Ed's video? I mean, there seemed to be a kind of collective horror at the idea that there would be enough surveillance cameras around a city that the government might know not only where you are at all times, but whom you're with. How many of you are carrying one of these? Yeah, exactly. Right? We call it the little police officer in your pocket because it knows where you are all the time. Your phone company is recording and storing that information. It knows what other phones are in proximity. If you know where this phone is and what phones it's with every morning between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., you know some very intimate things about my life. This power already exists. The ACLU was in the Supreme Court this year arguing that the police should at a minimum need a warrant from a judge in order to get that information, but under current law they don't. So it's actually a point about visualization. When you see the cameras, when you imagine the drone flying over your city, then you think, oh, there's someone in a room watching me hold hands. But these things are already in your bedrooms, so you're already being tracked pretty intimately and comprehensively.
It's not just the camera. I mean, it's the system. I mean, what does data look like? What's the visibility of this? And for most of us, it's an invisible state because we don't ever see it physically. We don't see it in a physical form, and because we only deal with it in a non-tangible form. So I mean, really, I mean, I guess this again goes back to any of you. Feel free to answer. But what does this look like? What's the visibility of data? And I think you've been working years on this.
I guess I've been thinking about this kind of thing for a long time, and it's kind of ironic that when I look at the longer arc of the kinds of images that I've made, they've gone from being very impressionistic and kind of surrealistic to like extremely quotidian, like look like literally nothing. Like some of the earliest works I was doing was going out into the desert and using telescopes and really powerful kind of cameras to try to photograph things that were very far away, and you'd get these very murky kind of landscapes that would be pointing to a military installation or a black site in relation to CIA things, or photographing the sky and looking for traces of spy satellites. And then really when I started working for you, working on some of the materials that the NSA programs that were being described in the reporting that you were doing, was looking at, oh no, you don't have to look for these little specks in the sky of surveillance satellites, or you don't have to go out into the desert of Nevada and look for these obscure military installations, that infrastructure of surveillance is so much a part of the built environment itself that it literally is, you can take a picture of anything that you want, and that is a picture of mass surveillance, right? And so like it's been a weird move in some of my work where I almost feel like Marguerite, in the sense where I take just a normal landscape picture of like whatever, and then I'll say, oh, this is this really important like surveillance thing. And like you could literally do that with any photograph.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is.
I think it's important to. I think it's important to remember also that this didn't happen by accident. This idea that surveillance is invisible, right? This was actually a strategy of creeping expansion, because any kind of powerful institution knows that there is one force that can actually resist these kind of things. And that is sustained public opposition, right? But it has to be passionate, it has to be committed. And that only happens when people are aware of it. That only happens when people can care about it. And this is the importance of art in this space, particularly the reform movement. We see in practically throughout history, every revolutionary movement, a strong central core of activism that arises from student movements, from cultural organizations, and from art movements particularly, because these are the groups that see things differently, whether it's because of a professional obligation to look at the world in this sort of a more considered way, or just the natural skepticism of youth, right, where this structure does not belong to them. They were born into it. It was put upon them rather than something that they helped build and put into place, where they feel a connection to it. And we don't have that for surveillance yet. It's only now beginning and growing. And these things largely break the surface and coalesce into a strong resisting force due to abuse, right? And this is the thing that they've been very careful to keep beneath the surface. We have terrorism watch lists and everything like that, which, as we have people on the stage who can attest, two of them actually, they're often wrong. They're thin. There's nothing underlying them. One person behind a desk somewhere makes a mistake, but that ruins someone's life for the better part of a decade if they're lucky, right? Some people, it's more or less the end of their lives. And the question is, how did we get to this kind of creeping strategy of quiet expansionism? And is that right? Is that proper? Is it appropriate? Is it something we should continue to go along with? I would argue that we have actual top secret documents now from the British intelligence agency, GCHQ. You can think of it as the British NSA, where they said mass surveillance programs were not classified to save lives. They weren't worried about efficacy. They weren't worried about efficiency. They weren't worried about attacks getting through. They said these things were classified to avoid, and this is a quote in their words, a damaging public debate about the scale of their activities that would enable legal challenges to their programs. And this is something that we see in government after government after government. Everybody does this because they know it's obviously the most effective strategy. The question is, how do we, people who are looking at the world from a different perspective, share this with people who don't have all day to become experts in this, right? This is not their job. It's not their hobby. It's not their interest. It's not their occupation. The sad tale of history is that they normally only become concerned when they must for survival, when their neighbors begin disappearing, right? When the consequences come home and you feel them personally. But by then it's often too late.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that we're going back to this video that you just showed, and we're all kind of shocked about this. Many of you are carrying those devices with you. It's not that they have to be mounted on the camera. I mean, there's a couple of questions that have come up, and very specifically iPhone 10 and mobile payments and things of these types, facial recognition. I mean, these tools are becoming so commonplace. This is no longer something of specialists. This is no longer, this has become such day-to-day general devices. So one of the things is that all of these devices are generating so much information. I mean, it's like when you look at the amount of data that your phone kicks out every single moment, I mean, I think it's frightening to see how much information your phone is there. And so, Kate, I think one of the things I want to ask you is that, with any of these machine learned systems, the more information that you provide, the more proficient it becomes. And as it becomes more proficient, then when it starts making decisions, then there's biases that go into the development of that algorithm or of that software that applies that once those machines are essentially, well, right now it's just in LS. I mean, I don't think we've had a full transition, or maybe we have, into these machines making decisions. But I want to talk about the proficiency and machine learning.
Well, it's interesting because when people hear terms like artificial intelligence and machine learning, we very quickly sort of hear about the singularity and killer robots, and that these are going to be systems that are basically sort of running the world. I think there's something much more nuanced that has already happened. And I think in many ways, the extent of it is simply not known. And Ed is exactly right that this is, I think, part of the reason that we haven't seen a big public outcry is simply because a lot of these technologies seem mystical and confusing and highly technical. And so people feel disempowered from talking about real world implications. Frankly, there are real-world implications. You're living them right now. We rarely see how much these systems are already determining your access to opportunities, but they already are. And I can assure you that we're starting to see that, certainly in China, but already in the US. I mean, I think there's this tendency to go, oh, China, it's really difficult there. Actually, it's really difficult here as well, because the US has, particularly the way that health insurance is structured here, it's very open to saying, well, we can see where you've been and actually how long you really were at the gym and how many times have you been going to fast food outlets, and maybe we'll just start to modulate and tweak how much you'll pay for your health insurance. There are structures here that are very open to taking this sort of data and then operationalizing it. So I think rather than fearing the robot apocalypse, we actually have to start thinking in a much more direct way about the fact that these systems are having impacts on our lives now. But the second thing I would say in relation to this distinction between the individual focus, which we go, oh, how is it affecting me? It's also affecting different types of populations, different communities differently. So if you are white, if you are well off, if you are highly educated, you're probably going to see the downsides of these systems a lot later. But if you're a person of color, if you're a person of low income, if you're in regions where there are less opportunities, you actually might start seeing these impacts now. And certainly if we look at the way that these systems are being deployed by the police in predictive policing, also by sort of non-government groups like Palantir, you can actually start to see some really frightening results, which is that if you start to target police attention on the groups who are said historically to have the most arrests or the most stops and frisks, as we say in New York, then what you've done is you've created a system of bias where it will always be paying greater attention to people of color, to people of low income. So we have systems now that do have real problems with bias. One of the things I do in my work is research that and try to open that up and to say, what are the limits? How do we actually start to engage with this technically, politically, and culturally? Because I think we have a moment now, but I think that moment's closing. I think within sort of 5 to 10 years, these systems are built into our infrastructure and they become extremely difficult to pull away.
Yeah, I mean, so if we follow this thing of, there's been plenty of examples of these software companies developing these bots. I mean, I think was it the Microsoft bot that became a Nazi?
That's right.
The Twitter
24
bot?
hours.
Within 24 hours, it learned to be a Nazi or a bigot, or yeah. I mean, there was just like this. I mean, and that's pretty scary when in that quickly it can develop these characteristics without those actually being built in from the beginning.
But what should scare you about that is the fact that it wasn't the bot, it was the people interacting with the bot, right? So it was the fact that we saw like a conscious campaign from 4chan and others to actually start to manipulate a bot so that it would start to spout, sort of racist, misogynist, and just generally appalling things, and completely succeeded. Right, so not only have we got systems where the historical, what's called training data that helps them see the world can have bias, is that you can actually start to game these systems. You can have groups that will say, we will actually begin to target a system to produce a result. So there's a whole lot of different vectors of concern that we need to really start to talk more about.
There were a couple of questions from the audience here.
There's actually one more sort of thing to follow up on that's interesting that people, I think, take for granted. And that's that data that is even you make voluntarily available for one purpose can be converted to a different purpose that did not have your knowledge, did not have your consent very quickly. There's a great example of this that actually comes from Russia, right, which knows something about surveillance, let me tell you. And this is an app called Find Face. There's a Russian clone of Facebook, right, because they want more centralized control over it, called VKontakte. And they screwed up per whether it's unintentional or whether it was entirely intentional, and basically left people's profile photos open to anybody out there to go and download with what's called sort of a spider. It just goes through and tries to get every single picture for every single person on the social network, right? Just to gather it. And people would go, oh, well, I put these out there. They're in public. They're on my Facebook. It's no big deal, right? But this app that works on any smartphone, Bloomberg, a news outlet, did a little test on where, well, let me just let it speak for itself.
I'm trying to do a little bit of an experiment.
Find Face is an Android app that lets you take a picture of a new friend or a complete stranger. In a few seconds, it scans all 250 million photos from VK, the Russian Facebook knockoff, and then finds a match.
All right, let's see what happens.
Oh, it's me. It's absolutely me.
Oh, it's me.
Yes, it's me. Definitely find me first.
Yeah.
So it works.
You like some girl and you take a photo and you can find her and text her or something.
Ladies, you might have met that guy. The problem with this, right, is think about the fact that for these millions of Russians who are using this social network, they didn't opt into that. Somebody didn't lock down their data properly, and now there's an app that they can't roll back because that company has already downloaded all of those photos. I think VK has locked down those photos since then, but for anybody who's in that database, they can't unring that bell. And just one last point on that video specifically, this is covered by a news outlet. Isn't it a little bit weird that they pick like the happy, funny music? They try to put a smiley face on something that's fundamentally problematic when we talk about the aesthetics of surveillance. This is the level of public conversation about some of these issues.
So there's a couple of things about centralization and decentralization. Really, I mean, I think this is a topic that keeps coming up with this. Where is when information is in a centralized location in a centralized place versus a decentralization of it and being split up across. So there's been a couple of questions specifically regarding, say, things like Bitcoin and blockchain that are not necessarily governmental, and that are not maybe or maybe not necessarily corporate owned either in a centralized system. Do you see any sort of, particularly as these become very hot topics, as these become more and more mainstream, is there some maybe not necessarily safety net, but is there some security or some sort of things that these devices or these types of decentralizations could help in dealing with these types of things, with like when you have vContact that have all the information like in a central location?
I think it's a good and a bad thing, just for a quick answer. You now have a system that is censorship resistant, right? That's really what decentralization provides in the simplest way. You've got replicated sort of presences. So you knock one down, there's another one that it fails over to. For people who are doing that with the right reasons, that's a wonderful, liberating technology. Now you can have activist groups that can't be shut down the way they have just been shut down in the Iranian protests that are still ongoing today. But on the other hand, if you have people who are using these for very negative purposes, now those are also harder to shut down. So you have to think about technology as sort of amoral. The question is, how do we express ourselves to construct a more moral world in that context?
So there's a question about how does the average American push back against corporate government surveillance in this situation?
Ben?
We've always known how to push back. It's not rocket science, it's just hard. It requires us to band together in groups of committed, activist citizens and demand what we want. Look at the National Rifle Association, whose positions don't enjoy majority support on anything, and yet they get their way because they're organized and they're committed, and they've placed that issue front and center. And the same thing can be done for other issues, but we actually have to care about them, and we have to do the work on it. So that's the sort of law and policy response. There's another dimension to this where I think actually, Ed would speak to it better, which is that there are things that we can do and that the technology community can do to provide protection, not just against our government, but against other governments, even if the politics haven't been able to catch up. So So over to you.
Okay, so there's the two sides of that. As Ben talked about, there's sort of the civil action, and then there's the direct action side. One of the fundamental things when we're talking about particularly the American context, and we're talking about specifically unlawful or unconstitutional surveillance. I say unconstitutional to distinguish the programs that are lawful in the sense of Congress, they passed a law, but the fact that that law itself was unconstitutional in the first place, and regardless of whether the government thinks it's okay or not, courts would disagree, but the government is simply very clever about keeping that case from ever being ruled upon to prevent the courts from playing their role in society. And look, we talked earlier about the fact that this is, in large ways, a military island, right? Not everybody, but there's a big presence here. Maybe some of you came from your bases, right? Maybe some of you have heard terrible things about me. And look, we know how the opinion shaping is formed. Whether it's you get a new guy who comes in and he's up on top and they send out all these nice little agency all memos about what he's doing and how great it is. And just these are their policies and all hands meetings to shape the opinion, to form a consensus in the workforce, a sense of community, right? And these things aren't necessarily malicious, but we need to be aware of the fact that they're happening, right? And don't ever lose your own critical sense of thinking. If you see something happening in the workplace that doesn't smell right, and you talk to your coworkers about it, and they don't think it smells right, and the only argument that anybody has against this is if you do something about this, you are going to lose your job or worse, which is what I was told. Recognize that that's not the end of the conversation. And think to yourself, what would it mean if tomorrow this fact was on the front page of every newspaper in the world? Because if it's serious enough, it really could be. And there is no question now that the programs of mass surveillance that I revealed in 2013, which at the time the government says were wall-to-wall lawful, they said nothing to see here, folks, move on, nobody's listening to your phone calls. President Obama changed from saying June 2013, nothing to see here, by January of 2014, just 6 months, saying these programs need to be ended, called on Congress to pass a new law. And he did say, while he could never condone what I did and the way I did it, fair enough, this conversation, talking about this issue, being forced to confront an uncomfortable controversy, but a necessary one, made us stronger as a nation. And President Obama and I don't agree on much, but we do agree on that. The courts ruled on this program finally, which they actually flushed from the courts just a few months before I came forward, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove that it was actually happening, to saying now that there is evidence, this program is not only likely unconstitutional, it is, and these are the court's words, quote, Orwellian in scope. And this is the difference, right, between allegation and fact, between speculation and certainty. And when we can cross that bridge for the public and bring everybody to a common understanding of facts, we can make better decisions, right? Because you cannot substitute the judgment of a few people behind closed doors and presume they're going to get it right 100% of the time. Maybe they get it right often, maybe they get it right most of the time, but constantly be listening, constantly be looking, and constantly be questioning about the next thing you see. Is this right or is this wrong?
So this is, yeah. So in looking at, those are, we're looking at things of government structures and so on, and the way, the internal workings of a lot of these. And a little bit ago, someone in the audience just made a remark about, we asked about how many of you are worried about government surveillance and how many are worried about corporate surveillance. And the question here was, is there a difference? And do we react to them differently?
Well, there are important differences and there are even more important convergences. But when we talk about the differences, we should keep in mind that that we consensually interact with the corporations that we interact with. Maybe not always in a meaningful sense, but you don't have to have a Facebook account. And that you don't really get to decide whether the government is going to surveil you. And that the government, but not Facebook, has coercive and lethal authority over you as a citizen. So these corporations can't yet, at least on their own, lock you up in a prison or fire a drone missile at you, which the government can do.
They can fire you from your job, though.
What'd you say?
They can fire you from your job, though.
No, for sure. And I mean, I would say that there are even more important convergences than that, which is that the corporations are doing the government's work. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI did not have the information on the US public that Facebook does. And so if the FBI can get that information from Facebook, it doesn't even need to collect it itself. And so we need to look really carefully at what the laws are about sharing between these corporations and the security state and the government. Did we lose you, Ed? Oh no, you're just giving us a slide. Yeah. Oh, to illustrate this, then the other
Thanks,
thing.
Ed. That's a good one.
This is a slide of the PRISM program about how the most powerful technology companies in the world were enlisted as arms of the U.S. surveillance state. I didn't realize I was going to get running pictures to go here. But I mean, I think that fundamentally you can look at another thematic convergence between what corporations are doing and what governments are doing, which is that they are aggregating massive amounts of information and then using secret processes on that information in order to make consequential decisions about your life in ways where you don't have the typical due process protections that you might have if you were brought to trial, say, or prosecuted. And so you already have scores that you get. You all know you have a credit score. But imagine that spreading into many, many more aspects of your life where you essentially have a consumer score and you have a citizen score. What line are you in the airport? Well, that may depend on some government process that is invisible that decides whether you're a threat or not a threat. And so, someone said before, this is about power, right? I think privacy becomes an antiquated word in this context. What we're really talking about is what power do institutions get from having all of this collected information? What decisions do they make? And then what kinds of fair processes are available to you in order to retain your rights in that kind of context?
I'd say, almost as a corollary, I think a lot about the word security in relation to that, because so many of these tools, especially on the government side, are deployed in the name of national security, creating security. But when I sit down here and thinking about what are the things in my life that make me feel insecure, it is things like my ability to get health insurance, my ability to, what is my credit rating? What are the ways in which my practical rights and liberties within the society are modulated by external factors that don't necessarily have my best interests in mind, right? So I think that for me, that's part of how I think about it as well.
And look at the text of the Fourth Amendment. Which side is security on? The right of the people to be secure against illegal government searches. We've sort of given up this word security and allowed the government to co-opt it entirely, but that's actually not the constitutional language.
So I'm going to jump forward a little bit because there was something that there's a really interesting question that came up, and I'm going to add a part to it as well. So the question was, what does a good future look like? And I would like to add to you on top of that, is there a safe space? What does that mean?
You want to jump in on this one? Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's
sorry, Kate, go ahead.
I was kind of going to throw it to you, Ed, actually, but all right, I'll jump in first. I think this idea of what does a good future look like, whoever in the audience asked that, by the way, 10 points. Thank you to you, sir, because I want us to talk more about that. We are all, as colleagues and friends on this stage and beyond, really aware of some of the very big problems we're going to face over the next sort of 10 plus years. But what I'd love to do is have more time to talk about what kind of place do we want to live in? What sort of society do we want to live in? What utopias could we actually be working towards? That's just as important to be thinking through. For me, in a very, very small way, sort of responding to Ed's comment about citizens coming together with a common understanding, I think we need a common understanding. So the first thing is to really understand how these systems are working and how they're affecting our lives. And my small part of that as a researcher is to create a space where that research can be done and then shared publicly and internationally. And I think everyone on this stage plays a different role in how we actually create that common understanding. In terms of a safe place, I don't know, we just went diving yesterday in Hawaii. That was pretty amazing. We can all move under the sea. That's a really hard one. I don't know, what would you say, Trevor?
Or two about what's going on under the sea.
Yeah, I know. The cables, you can tell us about, that's why I was throwing to Trevor, obviously.
Well, let me.
I think like that's a really important question in terms of thinking about what do we want, right? I mean, because I want Facebook actually, but I don't want it to be a predatory institution. But I want to be able to talk to my friends. I want to be able to share my life with people. I want to have a smartphone. Not even like want to have a smartphone. Let's face it, like we don't opt into Google. We don't consensually have a relationship to these corporations. If I want to have a job, I have to have a smartphone. That's how it is. We're not deciding to participate in this, surveillance capitalism or what have you. So I think taking a long, hard look at what we want and what kinds of information should be able to use in what kind of ways, right? Do we want to have the most intimate moments of our lives subject to whether it's scrutiny by national defense agencies or law enforcement, or by a Google or an Apple or a payday lender, for that matter? What things do we want to be able to do, and what protections do we want to be able to have in place? And I think that's just a generally good exercise. And the second part of that, I think that we really do need to think about what a civil society looks like and what kinds of political institutions are in place to do this. And this is a place that there's big debates in people working with technology. I'm not somebody that believes that there are technical solutions to a lot of this. I think it's great to use encrypted messaging apps and things like that, but that doesn't actually solve these problems. I think these are ultimately political decisions and political questions, and are going to have to be addressed through political institutions.
Yeah, I think, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was just going to thank the question, because it's actually really puts me in a bit of a conundrum, because I'm feeling so pessimistic. And I feel like, if you look at the people on the stage, we've all done work first in the war on terror, and it's like the unimaginable was happening. You think, like, how can we legalize torture and have Guantanamo? And it seems unimaginable. Then we had Obama, and we were like, oh my, we've got drone strikes, and people are like targeted assassinations, and it seems sort of unimaginable, an attack on the press, which happened under Obama, and now we have the current administration. So it just seems that this sort of pendulum keeps going and into this sort of unimaginably horrible future. But then I guess you see, I guess I would say that change happens in completely unexpected and unpredictable ways. And if I was going to say, like, as we sit here in this moment, we realize that the workspace today is a lot safer for a lot of women than it was 6 months ago. And so there are these sort of tipping points. When do they happen? How do they happen? We can't predict them, but I do think that it includes people taking collective action, people taking risks, people sort of fighting for a better future.
So Ed, why don't you go last? I'll follow Laura. So what future do we want? We want the benefits of all of these technologies without having to live in a dystopia. We want only the good parts and not the bad parts, and how do we get that? On some level, it's an impossible ask, and on another level, this is the role of law and values and policy, is to mediate our uses of these technologies in ways that maximize the societal benefits and minimize the harms. And the problem that law has had here, you always hear this line that, technology develops faster than law. Well, that was by design. It was by design because the technologists in the security state were trying to build their systems in secret without government consent, and because the technologists in Silicon Valley convinced all of us that the most important normative value was innovation. And that if we regulated them now, we would, God forbid, stifle innovation. That it was first too soon and now too late for that kind of interaction. But of course, if we want to have the world that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the harms, they have to innovate around our values rather than making innovation the goal and then telling us, as they have, privacy is dead, get over it, learn with it. So what do we do? What we have to do is use law and use our values to create much more friction here. The goal is not maximum efficiency, right? I mean, that's never been the goal in a democracy. We're trying to be inefficient in some ways. We don't want the security state to have maximum efficiency, otherwise we wouldn't have a Fourth Amendment. So how do we change that conversation? It's going to require changing two conversations. I mean, one is we need people like Ed who push out the government secrets into the light so that the public, rather than a few people in secret, make decisions. And then the other is we need, people like Kate to get inside the major technology companies and tell them that we're going to say what our values are. They don't get to tell us what our values should be.
So I'll put on my engineering hat for a minute to look at this from a little bit of a different angle. And that's the idea of root cause analysis, right? What is the real problem? The central connection between all of these structures that are causing us so much pain in exchange for the benefit that we're trying to gain, which is connectivity, right? We want to be able to interact. We want to be able to build sort of new communities beyond borders and reach each other. And a kind of invisible, involuntary tax is being imposed upon us without our meaningful knowledge, right? Surely they'll go, oh, well, we put up that legal thing that everybody clicks through. But they know everybody clicks through it. And they structure theirs to be 435 pages long so that no one can read it, even if they'd like to. And this makes me think that what we are actually missing here is a property interest in records about us. This primarily, I would argue, stems from a flawed decision in the Supreme Court in the 1970s, which we won't go into in that kind of detail. I'm sure Ben would be happy to talk to you afterwards if you can catch him before he runs off to the beach. But the idea here is the courts ruled in one harassment case, basically, where a guy was making crank phone calls. And the police had a pretty good idea of who he was because they had his license plate from one who saw a suspicious car drive off. And they went to the phone company and said, let us see his phone records without a warrant. And they did. And then the courts all tried to justify why this was okay because the guy was the bad guy and they wanted to put him in jail, and it's understandable, right? And they went, well, the records aren't his. The records belong to the phone company, right? And from that original sin, they extrapolated where one case of one bad guy there's the individualized suspicion that he's up to no good. None of us have any interest in any records about us, no matter who holds them. And from that, and the explosion of the ability to create records about us, now it is a free-for-all. Every company, every government, every structure of any kind of power and capability in this space at all is now trying to amass perfect records of private lives. And they can do anything they want with them. Because in the United States, we don't have a general privacy law that regulates this. The Fourth Amendment only restricts the federal government, right? And so where does this leave everybody else for protection against these corporations? And where does this leave us in sort of the ultimate outcome? And I think what is sort of abrading the health of our American society in this context of mass surveillance from all sides is it's about basic structural fairness. Even people who don't study the surveillance issue, who don't understand the issue, when you get them past literally Nazi propaganda, the Joseph Goebbels, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, which is false. Privacy isn't about something to hide, it's about something to protect. It's about your agency, your choice, your ability to decide who you are, who you want to become, to try out new ideas, and just have some part of the world that belongs to you and that you share voluntarily with those you trust, with those you love, to participate cautiously and test your ideas before introducing them out into the world. It is that central idea of fairness, right? When we talk about surveillance, is about power, right? Privacy is for the powerless. Privacy was never intended for the powerful. They have other mechanisms of asserting their prerogatives. Bill Gates doesn't need rights. He's got money, right? He can hire his own army. He can change the laws. He can get politicians he wants elected. But what about the person who's disenfranchised, who has no job, who's from a minority, who's from a poor family, who has no influence? They are the person that needs privacy the most, the one who is not ordinary, the person who stands out, who's a little bit different, who's a little bit unusual, who's a little bit strange. But these are the people from whom progress is born. These are the people who bring us forward into a different and better future because they see things differently. They are not comfortable, they're uncomfortable. And it is that discomfort that drives them to question how things can be improved. Whereas Bill Gates couldn't be more comfortable if you tried. And this idea fundamentally gets back to that concept of surveillance and power, that connection. It's about the distribution of power. And this, more than anything else, is what has shifted in the last 50 years in American society. When you look at it from any metric, right, when you're talking about economic equality and things like that, CEOs' pay is going up, worker pay is going down when you look on a dollar basis, right? When you talk about empowerment, the ability to influence society, governments have never been stronger than they are today. And I would argue that actually this dynamic is only now starting to be challenged and we're reaching an inflection point. But the idea is, should this be the case? What is the America you believe in, right? Even my biggest critics, right? The people who hate me, say I'm un-American, whatever, you got to ask them, what is it you are hoping for? What is that better future, right? Is it trust the government? Is it trust the law? Those are the least American concepts that we have. The law is great. We want to rely on the law, but the law has been wrong before. This is a country that enfranchised slavery. This is a country that disenfranchised women. This is a country who, in very recent history, said the government gets to decide what happens in your bedroom. I say that is un-American. And I say the fountainhead of these American ideas, of these equalizing forces in society, is the distribution of power, right? We are supposed to have in this country private citizens and public officials. We are supposed to know everything about them. They are supposed to know everything about us. And if that has changed, as I very much think it has, that is a danger. And that is something that it's up to us to change.
So I want to, Edward, I want to follow up with a little bit about this thing of the power and the agency of the individual, and particularly with looking at, we're having this conversation in the context of an art museum, with artists on the panel, and among other experts. But thinking about the artist and the roles that an artist has, the different levels of agency that art can take place, and and going back to Ben's comments about how these laws were intentionally antiquated, if you want to, I'm paraphrasing here, but so, we know that the technology is being developed at a very specific rate. There's new developments that are taking place hourly, moment by moment. There's new development taking place. And culturally, we're actually really good at keeping up with it. Think about your interaction with your smartphone 10 years ago versus now, and how quickly we've, as a culture, adapted to this technology. We're actually really adaptive beings, and we're pretty good at picking this up. The problem gets to be is when we get to legislation. What is the law about this, and how that affects us? So, one of the things is, and really what I'm framing these comments as is this looking at the relationship between format and content I mean, this is something that we discuss in art context all the time. This thing of, what is the format of the work? What does it look like? This is a painting. And then the content of this is a painting of, and why this was done. So, so Trevor, I mean, you've used these very classical modes of like landscape photography, and yet your content is incredibly contemporary in that sense. And in the same sense, Ed, you've been charged with the World War I era law that that the world is not the same as it was in 1917 to today. And then Ben and I were just talking a little bit ago that about the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is what your emails fall under. And that last time that was actually substantially overhauled was 1986, before the advent of the web. So, which actually, Ben, I mean, if you can just very briefly describe what that means, because it has a significant impact on how we live in this format and content.
I'm going to do an intervention.
Okay.
All right.
Do you want to jump in?
Here's my intervention.
Yes.
I want to know how much time we have, and I want to use it well.
Okay.
And I feel like that Ed just put a really compelling systemic argument on the table, and that it feels that I'd like to have a response to that. And I know that we're having people in the audience write questions, but I think we should open it up. And I'd like to know how much time we have.
Taylor, what do we have? We have 20 minutes. So good.
All right. I mean, I think that the cards are great, but I feel like we're like containing the room, and so I think it would be useful to like have response to what we're saying, and then go from there and use that time if I can get a consensus from that.
What do you? Yeah.
I want if there are people in the room that want to ask questions, and then we take it from there.
Keep them to 60 seconds. We are civil libertarians, but we will shut down your speech at the 60-second mark.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the front.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Here.
Thank you. I'd like to get a little bit more specific about power. I'd like to know what kind of power is being referenced here, because it seems very abstract to me. We're talking about power of corporations. We're talking about capitalism, right? We're talking about class power. We're talking about what drives innovation, what drives technology, whose needs, whose interests predominate. When we're talking about power, we're also talking about state power, right? We're not just talking abstract laws and courts. We're talking about the power of the state to enforce, in particular, a particular kind of class relationship amongst us, right? So when we're talking about that, many of the solutions that we end up coming up with don't actually challenge either of those two powers, right? This idea of like, we need to stand up as Americans, we need to demand corporations meet our definition of innovation. We're not demanding the end of capitalism. We're not demanding the end of state control over our lives, and I'd like to know why not.
Listen, I think you're right. I think we should be asking those questions, and we're not. I mean, I guess we could. I would say that we go back to this: how we could create more equality. That those people who are in power have to utilize their power to create more equality, not to amass more power. But then still, we have the sort of structure of capitalism that drives all of this. And yeah, Kate, do you want to?
I think, just real quickly from my side, it comes down to, what we think is attainable. And this is one of the reasons that I said earlier, a lot of these revolutionary movements, truly revolutionary, right? The things that do break the structure and try things in new ways, come primarily from young people, is they have the blessing of having not yet learned what is impossible. Because a lot of times they are miseducated by the world that they live in, and we think that these things are not possible. It is difficult for me to imagine, these kind of structural upheavals that completely restructure the earth outside of the single lever with which I am familiar, technology, right? And this gets into concepts such as encryption. You might have heard the FBI recently just crying every day in front of Congress, saying we don't want American companies to use actually reliable systems for protecting people's personal data because they work against us too. And we want to be able to get into any device, any computer in the country, no matter what. It's, they want to be able to enter any home. They want to be able to read any diary. They want to know everything about every life. And they have never had these capabilities before, but they've gotten a taste of it with the ability to read people's smartphones because we keep everything on that. And now that they've had a taste of it, they want to change that into being the status quo instead of reverting to the mean, where they have the evidence that's available to them rather than everything they could possibly want. The idea here is encryption, this way, this method of protecting our devices, is based upon fundamental universal laws, right? Mathematics, physics, science, not letters on a page, which, as wonderful as they can be in the things that they do for society, ultimately cannot defend our rights any more than a piece of paper can jump off the table and protect us. But when we express something through technology in a new way, when we create concepts, techniques that cannot be coerced through threat of force, through violence, this is a fundamental revolutionary change that already has and will continue to change the world. But that does raise other questions about, will this ultimately be used wisely, or will this be more harmful? And we don't know. But I guess when you ask that question of why people aren't doing this in more of a way, I know at least for me, it's because I've been taught that outside of my tiny area of lived experience, which I think we all share, we have these little narrow cones we see the world through. There are limits to what's possible and what's not. And it takes a new generation to change that.
I love that response. And I particularly like this question because you've asked us to go to a much bigger lens to start thinking about this problem. And the reason why it's so relevant that we really raise this now is because I think we have reached a stage of what I think of as almost feral capitalism. I mean, we've had a tax bill pass in this country that will be the most extraordinary transfer of wealth from what was left of the working and middle classes to the most wealthy and to corporations. And it is so extreme by any kind of historical standard that it is exactly the type of moment that you would expect some sort of popular uprising. And at exactly the same time where that would be what you would expect, we have precisely these tools that Ed has been talking about, which would make that more difficult than ever, which your ability to rise up as a populist, even to sort of respond politically in the way that we've seen revolutions happen in the past, has been profoundly abrogated. So given that, I think we're at, if you add into that climate change, we're starting to see massive population movement, we're going to see huge pressure on natural resources. We have a powder keg of extraordinary historical transfer of power and wealth away from the majority to the ultra minority. So I think it's gone well beyond end capitalism. I think we're really talking about looking at a profound phase change in how we have to start thinking about what life is going to look like 50 to 100 years hence. And that is an incredibly important question and probably the topic for a whole other different panel. But it's definitely something we should raise in this context.
Hey, I want to go to a question that's from the audience that I've been holding for a little bit, but I think this is really important, and this is a good time to bring this in. And what's the potential of art, and conversely, the limitations of art as an avenue for activism? And can it go beyond communications and more actively change the dynamics of power?
I don't actually see. I consider I do activism, I do art. I don't do art to do activism. I think they're kind of separate things. I think art is about expression and communication. And if you can reach people, then perhaps you change them. And that's what you try to reach people. So I'm just trying to reach people. And I think that's, I don't think it's a means to an end. I think we, that as human beings, we have a desire to express and communicate about the world that we find ourselves in. And that can be powerful, but it's also limiting. It's not going to start, well, I'm not going to, I'll leave it there. I was going to say it's not going to start revolutions, but I think it can.
I think we've had a couple of examples. Do you want to add something on?
Trevor, go ahead.
Think about it in a very similar way, and so, like I think my job doing art is to notice things, right? To learn how to see, And when I say that, I mean that very, very literally. Like, let's look at this seascape that Caspar David Friedrich looked at in the early 19th century. What is different now about it? And looking at that difference of that same exact landscape now versus 100 years ago, what can we learn about ourselves? How do we learn to see ourselves in new ways? And so for me, can be an adjacent project to a kind of more activist project, but it is different. But the other thing that I really want to strongly argue for in terms of art is that it's a place where you can do useless things, right? It's a things where you can do things that don't really have anything to do with the market, don't really have anything to do with the police, aren't really helpful to anybody for any kind of reason that you can kind of quantify. And I think like you can get a glimpse in that of what we might want to be as humans ultimately. And so it is that exercise.
Did you want to follow up, or?
Yeah, just briefly, Laura, I think you have a good point there about the motivations behind the production of art, right? At least in a personal example, but I would argue just from lived experience that art absolutely can be a lever, right? Now, I don't know what the intentions behind it were, but when I was thinking about personally whether to come forward or not, I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't tell the woman I had been with for like 7 years, who I loved more than anything in the world, because if I did, the FBI could charge her with the crime. They'd say she was a co-conspirator, right? So I was living in my own moment with the secret knowledge that the government every day was violating the rights of hundreds of millions of Americans and billions of people around the world, right? But was it worth it? What should I do? How do I contextualize this just on a personal human level, right? And is this the right thing to do? Should I? Is it wrong? Am I making a mistake? What if I don't understand it? Am I crazy? How can I do this in the most responsible way to minimize the potential harms while maximizing the public benefit? And I watched a documentary about Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, called The Most Dangerous Man in America. And that profoundly influenced me because it made me feel less alone. It made me realize other people have been in this position. And it showed quite clearly that there are some fundamental things about government that never change. They have a common script across administrations, across generations, because it's not really about the White House. It's about strong institutions and how they respond to what they consider to be subversives, right? And this is something that I think artists, for whatever reason, have traditionally been sensitive to, and possibly even sympathetic to. And I can't speak for anybody else, but I definitely say that art helped me.
Thank you, thank you. We have one.
Yes. Tell me when. Ready? This is to anybody on the panel. Millions of Americans have had their personal identifying information breached, either through the OPM, Office of Personnel Management, breach a few years ago, and more recently Experian. So here's my question with a focus on the future. My question is, I would love to see thought leaders from banks and IT, corporate America, irrelevant organizations, the White House, whatever, get together and figure out a plan, because we're all in a defensive mode, and I want our government and our nation to move to a proactive mode. I think we all understand that companies need to have access to some data. But when you're scared that your Social Security number has been breached and all your personal information, that's of concern. So I'm wondering, is there a plan on the table with anybody anywhere to help with this? Thank you.
Ed, do you want to take?
Sure, sorry, I was
Yeah.
trying to find my mute. I see Ben is wiggling in his seat over there.
Only
so
wiggling
give
to
him a
try to
break.
get you to answer this question.
Okay. So, this is a really challenging one, but again, I look at things from a weird perspective because I'm a technologist, and when you look at things structurally, you look at human behaviors. You think of them as emerging in response to a system of incentives. If you want to think people are generally rational, we know they're not, right? People do irrational things all the time. One only needs to look at news of the White House to know that. But when we think about the silence from the banks, from the big companies, from the big corporations about these kind of things, it's because their interests are not our interests. They're playing an adversarial game rather than a cooperative game. This is an effort to extract the maximum amount of benefit from a given set of rules that exist in society, and sort of run with that baton as far as they can before the race is over. And then sort of they collect reward based on how far down the road they got before they got caught. And whether we talk about cheating on Wall Street, whether we talk about anything where the fines don't equal the benefit that they gained from their sort of improper behavior, we need to be thinking structurally about the incentives. And as you say, we need the institutions that actually make the rules to be doing this. But how do you do that when the institutions that make the rules are the ones that benefit from not changing the rules? And this actually creates a fundamental friction in society where reform becomes impossible, and this makes revolution inevitable, right? I'm not saying we've gotten there yet, but it's a danger that I think these powerful groups don't take seriously at all. In the context of identity theft, for example, one of the important things to understand is there's no such thing as identity theft in these contexts. You're still you, right? This person is not a doppelganger. They didn't assume your face. They're not living in your house. They're not, sleeping with your family. What happened is the bank screwed up. What happened is the government who sent your tax refund to the wrong person screwed up. Their systems of validating these requests were flawed. And they're creating a language to put the responsibility for correcting that or preventing that on you, instead of on them who made the mistake in the first place. They're saying you didn't protect your Social Security number, but of course you did. It's Experian who lost it. It's OPM who lost it. It's not you who did anything wrong. So then why is it that we are the ones who are being made to bear the consequences? And the apparent answer from that is because we're the ones with the least ability to change that system of rules. And the ones who decide who's going to pay the price for this are the ones who they themselves do not want to pay that price, even though it was their mistake.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, gotcha.
Hi. So based on what Ed, you just said, and several panel members throughout, how do we do that? How do we create what I'm getting a sense of is an inevitable, perhaps, revolution to stand up to power in a way that hopefully doesn't require immense amounts of fear? How do we get ahead of that, if that's possible? This is me perhaps searching for an answer you may not have, or an answer that's not simple, but desperately hoping that there's an answer. How do we inspire people to come together beyond acts of individual courage against those powers, which I think clearly raise awareness and lead to moments like this, acts of art to do it, which I think this panel alone has been instrumental and helpful in, but how do we continue to push inspiration forward to create, what's the Weinstein of this moment that brings people together against secrecy and privacy and power, if there's an answer to that?
Well,
Final question. Let's just go around and everybody do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was gonna say that you're part of that answer. right? I mean, I think what you did in 2013 was one of these inflection points. And people don't see the world in the same way. People who are entering in a search on a search engine have a creepy feeling that someone might be looking over their shoulder. Good. I mean, bad for society, good for awareness. If you don't like that feeling, if you don't like the feeling of being watched, that's the beginning of a kind of awakening. And I think the other part of it, there's positive inspiration, and there's negative inspiration, right? We didn't know that oil pipelines were dangerous until they leaked. Why are we not having the same kind of response to these massive data breaches? These are oil spills. Someone coined the term database of ruin. Every one of us has that, information that's sitting on someone else's computer that if it became published would turn your life upside down in not a good way. Is that acceptable to us? We right now don't have a legal liability regime that punishes the people who make those mistakes. OPM, which lost all of our data to the Chinese military, the lawsuits against OPM were thrown out because they were immune from that kind of litigation. So, how do you, I'm speaking as a lawyer, but following up on what you said, Ed, about incentives, right? How do we actually take these feelings of disgust, anxiety, fear, and turn them into, policies that will make these bad outcomes less likely? So that's one part of the answer.
I'd like to say that it's probably not going to happen without fear. You're going to have to count on fear. I can assure you that the women who went on the record against Weinstein were terrified for good reason. And then, so I think then the question is that fear, is that risk, is it worth it, and what are you fighting for? And I think then you can use examples like that of people willing to go to that place, willing to take those risks as an example for also confronting fear. And I'll actually, I'm going to say a quote that as I was exchanging emails with Ed before I met him in Hong Kong. I asked him this. I said, why did you take this risk? And he said, the odds are against us, but odds don't matter when you win.
Have anything to add to?
Kate, Ed, do you want to take a crack at this one?
Kate, do you want anything before I give a final word?
Ed, I think you just said it best already. Look, I think this is such an incredible conversation, and I just want to say a giant thank you to all of you in the room for being part of this amazing time. And I do want to say that there is a lot of sort of positive energy around what can be done moving forward. The mere fact that we're having these conversations, the mere fact that what Ed did change, I think the work of everyone sitting on this panel today, and many, many more people are asking different sorts of questions. There is work to be done. I wouldn't be telling the truth if I didn't say that I wake up at 3 o'clock in a cold sweat frequently, thinking about how much there is to be done. But I am still overwhelmingly optimistic that we can actually do a lot here, and it's going to be through conversations like this and groups like this. So thank you.
All right, Ed, you have the final comment of the afternoon out here.
Yeah, I mean, first off, it's an honor to be on this panel with everybody. This has been amazing. But just to get back to the question, it was a very human question, and that's why I liked it, because it's not about who you are. It's not about what you've done. We need to understand that these things can't be given to us. Right? You can't wait for things to get better, because they never will. Nothing happens without someone taking that first step. You got to believe, guys, many of you live in Hawaii, right? It's a good place to be. I was making a lot of money for somebody without a high school diploma. It was a comfortable life, and it wasn't something I wanted to leave. When I was struggling with this, I was hoping against hope that this was going to come out, that somebody was going to do something about this. You got to remember, Obama campaigned on a platform of ending warrantless wiretapping. And this is one of those wonderful things that everybody's like, whew, we're off the hook. But he actually expanded it. He made it worse. He made it more intrusive. And this is the thing where you have to remember that the universe is not docile. And there are adversaries out there. They don't have to be evil, right, to compete against your interests. And the reason that we suffer so much as the citizens of the world today, rather than sort of the masters of the universe today, is because we have become too comfortable. We have smartphones, which are incredible. We can lay in bed at night with it until we drop it on our face, watching Netflix or YouTube or whatever. I know you've done it. Don't act like you haven't. And this is, we live in a tremendously privileged time, and despite how bad things have gotten in terms of our relative political strength, regardless of how little influence we have left to sort of reshape our destinies within the rules of the system as they're laid out for us, we have lives of the kind of comfort that, emperors and kings could not have imagined in generations past. And that goes a long way to suppressing people's ability to eat fear and walk out into it, right? You asked, how do we basically change the world without being afraid? And that is the question that answers itself. You don't. You have to be willing to be afraid. You have to be willing to be terrified. You have to recognize that what we're doing is risky. It's dangerous. There is no guarantee of success, but it is still worth doing because we have a chance to win. And sometimes that's enough, right? You don't need a guarantee. You don't need to save the world by yourself. All you need to do is place down one brick upon which the person behind you can lay another. And that is how we build a better structure. That is how we build a better world. You have to make people care. You have to make people uncomfortable. You have to make people recognize that this is the world we've been given, but it is not the only thing that we can possibly have. Life is not a zero-sum game, right? There are no heroes. There are only good choices made in moments by people who were terrified. Let that next choice be yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
That's Mahalo's, guys.